Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and today was another big day. Every day this week is potentially going to be a huge day in Brexit, in that Boris Johnson brought forward two motions for crucial votes. The first one was for his withdrawal agreement bill, and MPs got to vote on it to say whether there should be a second reading. The way these things work to go into law, there needs to be three readings in the House of Commons, which after the second reading can include amendments, and then it would go to the House of Lords where they would debate it. If they've got any issues with it, they're going to have issues with it, then they will sort of amend things themselves, pass it back to the House of Commons. The House of Commons are fine with it, otherwise they're going to mess about with that as well. So there was always this process was always likely to take a long time. But the other vote Boris Johnson wanted to put forward was this 3-day timetable, which was realistically a 2-day timetable because they spent today talking about it, and there was going to be 2 further days on this withdrawal agreement bill in Parliament, and he wanted the whole thing completed in that time. So on the first vote, which was for, do you want this withdrawal agreement bill to go forward to a second reading, he won by a majority of 30, and that was expected. It meant that later on he was able to explain, and this will be the line he's using for the general election. He was able to use the line that at last people said it couldn't be done, but I have got an agreement that's passed the House of Commons, and they said the backstop couldn't be removed. I have removed the backstop. Yeah, you have, by making it a permanent feature, by putting a border inside the United Kingdom. But anyway, that doesn't matter. What matters is that in order to get his withdrawal agreement through, he made the most outrageous threats to really get those Labour rebels voting for it, as well as some of the Tory rebels as well. And one of them was about a general election, and he was really billing this as this is between my deal and no deal. We're leaving on October the 31st, banging that drum again. And if not, there's going to be a general election. He hasn't said anything about a general election after losing the votes that I'm going to tell you about next. It was all bluff anyway. He has no power to call a general election. Prime Minister used to have that power. If he'd have had that power, he would have already called one, because he was desperate to call one for the 31st of October, because that meant that Parliament would have already been dissolved. It wouldn't exist now. We'd be running up to a general election. He'd be running down the clock and taking us out with no deal. So the second vote, which as I already said is lost, I'm sure many of you would know that anyway, was for the 3-day timetable, and that was defeated by a majority of 14. Now, I have to say that was a larger majority that it was defeated by than I expected. But it was still, in my opinion, a disgraceful number of MPs, 308 of them, I think, that voted in favour of this ridiculous timetable. This is the most complex piece of legislation that any of these politicians will ever have dealt with in their lives. And the notion that they can get through this, with some of them not even reading it, many of them not even reading it, but the ones who are actually wanting to do their jobs not being allowed to properly consider it. Because bear in mind, there are many MPs who cannot read it and absorb the full implications. Bear in mind with the withdrawal agreement, the bill itself is really large, but it cross-references with lots of other documentation and legislation as well. So actually, every time you come to a bit that refers to another piece of legislation or something somewhere else, and you go there and read that, actually, when you come to this thing, be the size of a large book. It's huge, absolutely massive. There was a Labour MP from Hull who stood up and said that he spent longer thinking about his last sofa that he bought than MPs are expected to spend on this. And that's true. Anyone, you or I, thinking about even a semi-major purchase would spend a lot longer considering it than MPs are going to be spending considering this bill. Some people spend longer thinking about their holiday plans or even just weekend plans than MPs were expected to discuss the most far-reaching piece of legislation that they are expected to pass. But it failed. it failed. It was distressing to me just how many. But where's the cock up here? Am I just trying to say, oh, he failed the votes, that's the cock up? No, it's not. Because in actual fact, that's not a failure or a sign of incompetence that Boris Johnson couldn't get it through. No parliament for any prime minister, for any such piece of legislation, should ever agree to getting it through within 3 days. It's ridiculous. You know, people who are looking at this are saying, well, this is like a month. This is 4 weeks we need for this. And that's with this. And where's the Queen's speech gone in all this? Boris Johnson shut down Parliament for another week to say, oh, we must have a Queen's speech. It's absolutely vital. They had the Queen's speech. They were supposed to be voting on the Queen's speech. What's happened to that? Doesn't seem that important. Because, of course, it never was. It was just to waste 2 weeks, wasn't it? 1 week proroguing Parliament and another week having the Queen's speech and then all the debates on it, which they're not even bloody well voted on. But no, where he's cocked up, I'm getting to it, where he has messed up or where Dominic Cummings has messed up, whoever you want to look at it, they were desperate to reduce the likelihood of getting an extension. They want their no-deal Brexit this month. Yes, the agreement, the actual withdrawal agreement bill allows them to get their no-deal Brexit at the end of 2020, but they don't want to risk that. Apart from anything else, that's another 14 months. Parliament has time to monkey about. They'd much rather do it now. It's their best chance to do it. To that end, as I was speculating, they've got the EU to agree that there's no need for an extension, no need for a delay, because Boris has said he's going to get all this all through by the end of October. And also, because they've said that, and because politically the various people in the EU, the front runners, the players, the leaders, whatever you want to call them, whether it be heads of state, heads of government, or whether it just be senior members of the Commission or the Council like Donald Tusk, they've been wanting to do it to avoid Brexiteers saying, oh, look, they're really offering the extension very readily. It's because they don't want us to leave. Well, no, they don't want us to leave, but it's like they're trying to trap us. So politically, they wanted to leave it as late as possible. And my worry was they think that maybe right at the end of the month is still enough time, but Boris Johnson could actually legally delay it for a couple of days and therefore we run out. And that was my fear, that it wasn't offered this week. For me, offering it next week is dangerous. Well, because of what Boris Johnson has said and done today, I have just seen a tweet from Donald Tusk, the EU Council President, saying that in light of what's happened and been said, he is going to urge the EU Council to offer an extension immediately. Now, of course, everyone will be saying, well, it's not up to Donald Tusk. No, it's not. It's up to the EU member states, the individual EU member states, which all have their own heads of government, all deciding. This is absolutely true. But if you don't believe that Donald Tusk isn't in regular contact with them and they've already been discussing their various ins and outs, they're not stupid people. I know you might imagine that because we've got a stupid head of government that maybe everyone else has as well. No, they don't. They're not idiots. And certainly the senior members of the EU are not idiots. Never mind what they say publicly. Politically, they know what Boris Johnson has been trying, I'm sure. And they also know what sort of person he is. They've just been keeping an eye on it because there was a realistic prospect of him being able to railroad this through Parliament. If there wasn't a realistic prospect, I wouldn't have been worried. There was. It didn't happen. So now they will have been discussing the ins and outs of it. So I don't think it will turn out that Donald Tusk was talking out of line. I think it's very likely that they basically already discussed this scenario and that he's just basically acting on that. We will see in the next couple of days. I'm not saying an extension request is going to come immediately, but it does now give me hope that it will come this week, which was what I wanted, because if it comes this week, even if it comes on Friday, Boris Johnson will not be able to delay it for the rest of next week, because the Benn Act says that if the EU offer an extension, first of all, if they agree to the January the 31st extension, then it's just automatic. because that's what the legislation required. I imagine it still technically has to come before Parliament. I'm not quite sure, but it's a fait accompli. It's done. But of course, if the EU offer a different extension, and I still hope they will, because I see us needing another one after January the 31st. I don't care what happens. We might only be having the general election in January. But of course, because Jeremy Corbyn seems to still want one, it is still very likely to happen in December, especially if the extension is confirmed early next week. And Boris Johnson, even if they come back with a longer one, won't be able to delay it enough. The Benn Act requires him to accept it immediately and then bring it to a vote in Parliament within 2 days. And remember, there's that box of Scottish judges waiting to pop out because they haven't finished. They're on standby. They're on vigil. If he does anything slightly out of line, they'll be straight on him. So he can't. He will have to introduce that for a vote for Parliament at least 2 days before the Brexit deadline, if we get the extension formally offered to us this week. So we're good. Essentially, I don't think Donald Tusk is going to come out of this looking silly. I don't think we're going to have a situation, because I'm sure he hasn't spoken out of turn. I'm sure this has all been already pre-agreed. And the extension's coming, and there's now nothing can be done about it. That's not to say Boris Johnson can't get his no deal eventually. He can't now get it this month. He has messed it up royally. And this is the thing. I was asked yesterday to give someone some hope. They were really worried on Twitter. And the ray of hope I gave them was simply this. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have cocked up every time. Boris Johnson has not won a single victory against the opposition. Now, you could argue he technically has today, because Labour said that MPs shouldn't have voted for the second reading of the bill. So you can actually chalk that up as to a victory, a Pyrrhic victory as it seems. But in terms of his battles against the opposition, certainly the case was yesterday, he had not won a single victory. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings have cocked up every time. That's not to say they haven't won little victories, but they are only possible, remember, because the opposition won't get rid of them. Which is madness still. Madness. So there we go. That's hopefully caught you up with the latest events. There'll be more coming, hopefully thick and fast for the rest of the week. Hopefully an extension before long. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. Until next time, I'll see you later.